"I cheated on you," the CEO said to his pregnant girlfriend. A year later, he found her in the hospital with twin daughters. What he didn't know next, no one could ever believe. A very powerful story, but before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe and comment. I love Mr. Peter. Let's start with love. The confession tasted like blood in Ian Bell's mouth, metallic and wrong. As he watched rain streak down the windows of his office, while the woman carrying what he believed was his child sat behind him in the gathering darkness. He had rehearsed this moment for days, imagined 1,000 different ways to wound her less. But cowardice always finds its truest voice in the end, so he spoke without turning around, his reflection in the glass showing him exactly the monster he was becoming. "I cheated on you." Amy Jones didn't gasp or cry out. The silence that followed his words felt alive, predatory, filling the space between them with something that made Ian's skin crawl. He heard the leather sofa creak as she stood, heard the whisper of her maternity dress against her legs, heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like drums announcing an execution. Still, he couldn't turn around. Still, he stared at the blurred city lights and hated himself with an intensity that should have burned him to ash where he stood. "Her name was Claire," Ian continued, the lies flowing easier now that the first truth had escaped. "Australian consultant. Singapore conference. We were both drunk after the gala, and I don't have excuses, Amy. I don't have reasons that matter. It happened once, one night. One catastrophic mistake that I've regretted every second since. Look at me." Amy's voice cut through his rambling confession like a blade, quiet and lethal. Ian turned slowly, bracing himself for tears or rage, for thrown objects or screaming accusations. Instead, he found her standing by the door with her purse already in hand, her coat draped over one arm, her dark eyes clear and dry and utterly empty of anything resembling the woman he thought he knew. She looked like a stranger wearing Amy's face, beautiful and terrible and completely unreachable. "You don't get to do this facing away from me," she said. "You don't get to confess your sins to a window and call it honesty. You wanted to tell me you destroyed us. Fine. Tell me while looking at what you're destroying." Ian took a step toward her, hands raised in supplication. "I love you. I know I have no right to say that after what I did, but I love you, Amy. I want to fix this. Tell me how to fix this." "There's nothing to fix, because there's nothing left." Amy adjusted her purse strap, the movement so casual it felt obscene given the magnitude of the moment. "You made a choice in Singapore. You looked at what we had. At me, at our future, at the life growing inside me, and you decided it wasn't enough to keep your pants on for one business trip. That's not a mistake, Ian. That's a revelation. It meant nothing. She meant nothing. You're everything to me." "If I was everything, you wouldn't have slept with her." Amy moved toward the elevator with deliberate steps, each footfall a countdown to the end of everything. "If I was everything, you would have come home and told me immediately, instead of carrying this secret around for weeks like a coward. If I was everything, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Ian blocked her path, desperation making him bold. "The baby, Amy. Think about the baby. Our child deserves both parents. You can't just walk away from that." Something flickered across Amy's face then, something that looked almost like pity, which somehow hurt worse than anger would have. "The baby will be fine. Better than fine, actually, because I'm going to make sure my child never learns that betrayal is something you forgive just because someone says sorry. I'm going to make sure my child knows their worth, knows what they deserve, knows that love without loyalty is just pretty words from pretty liars." "What are you saying? You're leaving? Just like that? After everything we built together?" "What did we build exactly?" Amy pressed the elevator button, her fingers steady despite the bomb she was detonating. "I built trust. I built faith. I built dreams about a future with a man I thought I knew. You built lies. You built justifications for why fidelity didn't really matter as long as you came home eventually. We weren't building the same thing at all. Ian, we never were." The elevator chimed its arrival, and Ian felt time compressing, felt the final seconds of his relationship draining away like sand through his fingers. Please don't go, stay, just for tonight. Let's talk this through like adults. Let's figure out what comes next. I already know what comes next. Amy stepped into the elevator, turned to face him one last time. You're going to call and text and show up at my apartment begging for another chance. You're going to send flowers and gifts and heartfelt apologies. You're going to promise you've changed, that it'll never happen again, that I'm the only woman you'll ever love. And I'm going to be gone, Ian, not just from your life, but from your world entirely, because I learned something important from my grandmother before she died. What's that? That women with options don't stay with men who cheat. That self-respect isn't negotiable. That the only power we truly have is the power to walk away from people who don't deserve us. The elevator doors began to close, and Amy's expression shifted into something that looked almost like peace. You taught me who you really are tonight. Thank you for that. At least now I know what I'm leaving behind. Amy, wait. The doors sealed shut with brutal finality. Ian lunged forward, slammed his palm against the brushed steel, pressed the button repeatedly like a madman. But the elevator was already descending, already carrying her away, already erasing her from his life with mechanical efficiency. He stood in the empty hallway, breathing hard, waiting for the panic to subside into something manageable, but it only grew stronger, spreading through his chest like ice. She'd come back. She had to come back. Pregnant women needed support systems, needed medical care, needed someone to help them navigate the terrifying journey toward motherhood. Amy was practical, logical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Once she calmed down, once the initial shock wore off, she'd realized that leaving made no sense, that their child needed stability, that whatever anger she felt toward Ian couldn't outweigh the reality of their situation. He returned to his office, sank into his chair, and began composing a text message that would explain everything better than his clumsy verbal confession had managed. The words came slowly, carefully, each sentence crafted to convince her that this wasn't the end, that people made mistakes and learned from them, that their love was stronger than one night of weakness. He wrote and deleted and rewrote for hours, until the city lights below began to dim, and the cleaning crew arrived to empty his trash cans. When he finally sent the message, the response came back immediately. Number disconnected. Ian called her phone. Disconnected. He tried her work email. Bounced back with an address not found error. He checked her social media profiles and found them deleted. Every trace of her online presence scrubbed clean as if she'd never existed. The panic in his chest transformed into something darker, something that tasted like understanding beginning to dawn. She wasn't coming back tomorrow. She wasn't coming back at all. Over the next 72 hours, Ian became a man possessed. He drove to her apartment and found it empty, the lease terminated, her belongings vanished. He called her workplace and learned she'd resigned effective immediately. He contacted mutual friends and discovered she'd blocked all of them, cut every tie that connected her to her previous life. He hired the best private investigator in the city, handed over an obscene retainer, and demanded answers. The investigator returned 3 weeks later with a single piece of information. Amy Jones had disappeared more thoroughly than people usually managed without criminal intent or witness protection. No forwarding address, no paper trail, no credit card activity, nothing but emptiness where she used to be. Ian stood in his office once again, staring at the rain-soaked windows, and finally understood what Amy had tried to tell him in those last moments before the elevator doors closed. She hadn't been threatening to leave. She'd been announcing a decision already made, already executed, already irreversible. Women with options don't stay with men who cheat. She'd had options he never knew about, resources he'd never suspected, and she'd used them to erase him from her life with surgical precision. Somewhere out there, Amy Jones was building a new life without him, and she was taking his child with her into a future where Ian Bell simply didn't exist. Chapter 2. The Ghost Year. Seasons changed outside. Ian's windows, like scenes in a play he was no longer participating in, and he watched them with the detached interest of a ghost haunting his own life. Spring became summer, became autumn, became winter, and through it all, the private investigator sent monthly reports that said nothing, found nothing, led nowhere. Amy had vanished into thin air, taking with her not just herself and the baby, but every assumption Ian had built about how the world worked. His life continued despite the gaping wound at its center. Meetings happened. Deals closed. Money accumulated in accounts he barely checked. People congratulated him on achievements he couldn't remember pursuing. And he smiled the right smiles, said the right words, played the role of successful young CEO with the skill of someone who had perfected the performance until it became indistinguishable from reality. But at night, alone in the penthouse he'd bought to impress Amy, Ian became someone else entirely. He sat in the dark and calculated. The baby would have been born by now. 3 months old. 4 months. 6 months. Learning to roll over, to grab objects, to recognize faces. Did the child have Amy's eyes, her smile, his stubborn chin? Did it matter that he'd never know that somewhere in the world his own flesh and blood was growing up without any awareness that he existed? The investigator suggested they were probably overseas. Australia, maybe, given Amy's connections there. Or Europe, where money could buy anonymity more easily than in America. Or hiding in plain sight in some small town where nobody asked questions about single mothers with perfect credit and mysterious pasts. Every lead dissolved like sugar in water, sweet and promising, until suddenly it was just gone. Ian dated because his mother insisted, because his friends grew tired of his moping, because sitting alone felt like surrender. He took beautiful women to expensive restaurants and couldn't remember their names by dessert. They weren't Amy. They didn't tilt their heads the same way when they laughed. They didn't challenge his assumptions or call him out when he was being insufferable. They didn't make him want to be better, so he didn't try to be better around them. "You're going to die alone if you keep this up," his mother informed him over brunch one Sunday, her disapproval sharp enough to cut glass. "That woman left you over a year ago. She's not coming back. Move on. She was pregnant with your grandchild." Was she, though? His mother sipped her mimosa with practiced elegance. "You only have her word for that. Maybe she lied. Maybe she was never pregnant at all. Maybe the whole thing was some elaborate scheme to get money out of you, and when you didn't propose fast enough, she disappeared with whatever she could grab." Ian set down his fork with exaggerated care, fighting the urge to overturn the table. "Amy didn't need my money. She had her own career, her own life, her own—" "Oh, please. Everyone needs money, darling, especially single women with expensive tastes and no visible means of support." His mother gestured for the waiter to bring more champagne. "You're better off without her. Find yourself a nice girl from a good family. Someone with proper breeding who won't run off the moment things get difficult." The rest of the meal passed in hostile silence. Ian paid the check, kissed his mother's cheek out of habit, and drove home thinking about how little she understood about anything that mattered. Amy hadn't left because things got difficult. She'd left because Ian had made them impossible. She'd left because he'd proven himself unworthy of her trust, and unlike his mother, Amy didn't believe that breeding or money or social standing mattered more than basic human decency. Work became his refuge because work demanded nothing emotional. He threw himself into projects with manic intensity, staying late every night, arriving early every morning, building something that felt productive, even if it was ultimately hollow. His board of directors loved the results. Profits soared. Market share expanded. Industry publications wrote glowing profiles about his leadership vision and strategic brilliance. But sometimes, in the middle of important meetings, Ian would zone out completely and wonder what Amy was doing right now. Was she reading, working, playing with the baby? Had she found someone new, someone who didn't sabotage relationships by sleeping with random conference attendees? Had she built a new family that looked nothing like what they could have had together? The investigator called one afternoon with news that sent Ian's heart racing. A possible sighting in Portland. A woman matching Amy's description, seen with a baby carrier at a farmer's market, gone before the investigator's local contact could get closer. Ian caught the next flight out. Spent 3 days walking the streets like a lunatic, showing Amy's photo to vendors and shoppers and anyone who would look. Nothing. Another ghost, another false hope. Another reminder that searching for someone who didn't want to be found was like trying to hold water in his bare hands. On the anniversary of Amy's disappearance, Ian sat in his office nursing expensive whiskey and contemplating the ruins of his life. He'd lost Amy, lost his child, lost any chance at the family he'd started to imagine before his own weakness destroyed it all. And for what? For one drunken night with a woman whose face he could barely remember, whose name he'd probably invented on the spot to make the confession feel more honest. He'd traded everything for nothing, and now nothing was all he had left. His computer chimed with an incoming email. Probably work. Probably something urgent that didn't actually matter. Ian almost ignored it, but the subject line caught his attention. No subject. He opened it. No text, just an image. A hospital bracelet, slightly blurry, but the text clearly visible. Baby girl A. Jones, and below it, baby girl B. Jones, with dates exactly 3 months after Amy had walked out of his life. Twins. The whiskey glass slipped from Ian's hand, shattered against the hardwood floor, and he didn't even notice. Amy hadn't been carrying one child. She'd been carrying two. Two babies who existed somewhere in the world. Two lives he'd never known about. Two pieces of himself that he'd lost before he even knew they existed. The email had no sender, no return address, no way to trace its origin. Just that single image, that devastating proof that Amy's disappearance had hidden even more than he'd imagined. Ian stared at the screen until his eyes burned, memorizing every detail of those hospital bracelets, and felt something shift inside his chest. He'd spent a year grieving one lost child. Now he had to grieve two, and the weight of it felt like it might crush him entirely. Chapter 3. The Hospital. The Seattle skyline looked different through airplane windows than it did in photographs. Sharper somehow, more real, and Ian pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching the city approach with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. This trip had nothing to do with Amy or the twins. Pure coincidence. His company was considering a partnership, needed him to tour a facility, needed his signature on documents that would have seemed important before he learned about the hospital bracelet email. Everything felt like going through motions now. Life was something that happened around him while he remained frozen in the moment Amy walked away, permanently stuck watching elevator doors close on his future. The car service driver made small talk about Seattle weather and local restaurants, and Ian made appropriate noises while his mind chased itself in circles. Twins. The word had become a mantra, a prayer, a curse that followed him through every waking moment. The hospital was exactly the kind of modern facility his company typically partnered with. All glass and steel and expensive architecture, designed to make people forget they were surrounded by illness and death. Ian followed the administrator through pristine hallways, half listening to pitches about their pediatric wing and cutting-edge treatment programs, nodding at appropriate moments while his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Then he saw her. Amy Jones stood in a corridor 20 feet away, speaking with a doctor, and Ian's entire world lurched sideways. She looked different. Older maybe, though only a year had passed. More polished. She wore a suit that probably cost more than his first car, tailored perfectly to her frame, with jewelry that caught the fluorescent lights and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo that would have taken hours, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that made everyone around her seem slightly dimmer by comparison. This wasn't the Amy he remembered. The Amy he knew had worn sensible shoes and brought packed lunches to save money. This Amy looked like she could buy the hospital if the mood struck her. Ian stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to process the woman he'd spent a year searching for, standing casually in a hallway discussing something with a physician. Like this was the most normal thing in the world. The administrator beside him continued talking about treatment success rates and funding opportunities, oblivious to the fact that Ian's entire universe had just collapsed and reformed around the woman in the expensive suit. Amy finished her conversation, turned, and her eyes landed on Ian with the kind of blank recognition you'd give a stranger whose face seemed vaguely familiar. Not surprise, not anger, not even really acknowledgement of their history. Just a cool, assessing look that lasted maybe 2 seconds before she shifted her attention back to the doctor. Ms. Jones, the administrator had apparently been trying to get her attention. This is Ian Bell, potential investor in our expansion project. Mr. Bell, this is Amy Jones, one of our most generous benefactors. She's been instrumental in funding our pediatric respiratory research program. Amy extended her hand for a professional handshake, her grip firm and brief. Mr. Bell, nice to meet you. We've met before, Ian managed, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Have we? Amy's expression didn't change, polite and distant and utterly impenetrable. I meet so many people at these kinds of events. Forgive me if I don't remember. She was lying, obviously lying. They'd lived together for over a year, planned a future together, created 2 children together, and now she was pretending they were strangers who might have crossed paths at a cocktail party once. Ian felt rage and heartbreak and confusion warring in his chest, but before he could respond, a small girl appeared from a nearby room, moving with the careful steps of someone conserving energy. Mama, the child couldn't have been more than 4, with Amy's features stamped across her face, with big dark eyes that looked tired in a way children's eyes shouldn't. She wore hospital pajamas and carried a stuffed elephant under one arm. Rory, sweetheart, I told you to stay in your room while I talked to the doctors. Amy's entire demeanor shifted, the cool, professional mask melting into warmth as she bent down to the girl's level. Are you feeling okay? Do you need your inhaler? I'm fine. I just missed you. The girl, Rory, one of the twins from the hospital bracelet, leaned against Amy with the comfortable trust of a child who knows she's loved without question. Is that man going to help me get better? Amy glanced up at Ian, and for just a moment he saw something flicker across her face. Pain maybe, or regret, or just exhaustion from carrying burdens he couldn't begin to imagine. Then it was gone, replaced by that same professional neutrality. This man is just visiting the hospital, baby. He's not your doctor. Come on, let's get you back to bed. You need to rest. But Dylan's bored, Rory protested. Can she come out too, please? Dylan's doing her homework in the family lounge. You can see her in an hour. Right now, you need to rest. Amy scooped the girl up with practiced ease, cradled her against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd been through battles Ian couldn't fathom. Excuse me, Mr. Bell. I need to attend to my daughter. She walked away without looking back, disappeared into a room down the hall, and Ian stood in the corridor feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. The administrator launched back into his pitch about funding and partnerships, but Ian heard none of it. His mind was stuck on that little girl's face, on the way Amy had held her, on the mention of Dylan doing homework somewhere else in this building. The twins weren't just theoretical anymore. They were real. They were here. They were sick enough that one of them needed to be hospitalized, and Amy was handling it alone. Had been handling everything alone since the moment she walked out of his life. Ian's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, pretended to check an urgent message, and cut the hospital tour short with vague promises to review the partnership materials and get back to them soon. He found a bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and tried to remember how to breathe around the tightness in his chest. Amy was here in Seattle. The twins were real. One of them was sick enough to be in the hospital. And Amy was wealthy enough, powerful enough. Confident enough to treat Ian like a stranger she barely remembered meeting, he'd spent a year searching for her. A year grieving and obsessing and falling apart. And she'd spent that same year building an entirely new life where he simply didn't matter. Where he was so irrelevant that she could pretend not to know him in a hospital hallway without even pretending very hard. Ian splashed cold water on his face, stared at his reflection in the mirror, and made a decision. He'd come to Seattle for business. Now he was staying for something far more important. He was staying until he understood what had happened to Amy in the year since she left. How she'd transformed from a mid-level consultant into a woman who funded hospital wings, and whether there was any possibility, any chance at all, that he could find his way back into her life. Even if she didn't want him there, even if his presence caused more pain than healing. Even if the only thing he accomplished was watching from a distance as she raised two little girls who would never know he existed. He had to try. Because the alternative was going back to his empty life, his meaningless success, his hollow relationships, and pretending that seeing Amy and Rory today hadn't ripped open every wound he'd spent a year trying to close. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. Ian rearranged his entire schedule with 3 phone calls and a string of lies about unexpected opportunities that required his immediate attention in Seattle. His assistant sounded confused but compliant. His board members expressed mild irritation but ultimately acceptance. And within hours, Ian had transformed a 2-day trip into an indefinite stay at a hotel near the hospital where his daughters, because he'd already started thinking of them that way, were presumably living some portion of their lives. He haunted the hospital like a ghost, learning its rhythms and routines, discovering which shifts the friendly nurses worked and which coffee shop Amy favored when she needed a break from watching Rory sleep. Ian told himself he was being protective, cautious, strategic in his observations. But the truth tasted bitter even inside his own head. He was stalking the woman he'd driven away, inserting himself into her life without permission, justifying it with concern about children who didn't even know his name. The twins were not identical. He learned through careful observation and strategic conversations with staff members who thought he was just another concerned potential donor. Rory, the girl he'd seen in the corridor, had some kind of respiratory condition that required monitoring and treatment. Dylan, her sister, was healthy and vibrant, but refused to leave the hospital for more than a few hours at a time because separating the twins caused Rory's stress levels to spike dangerously. "Miss Jones is here every single day," a nurse told Ian, while he pretended to review hospital literature in a waiting area that offered a clear view of the pediatric wing. "Rain or shine, emergency or not, she shows up at 8 in the morning and stays until Rory falls asleep at night. That's real love right there. That's a mother who'd burn the world down to save her baby." Ian thought about Amy sitting in his office a year ago, her hand on her pregnant belly, listening to him confess his betrayal, and felt shame crawl up his spine like something alive. She'd been preparing to tell him about the twins that night. He knew it with sudden, crushing certainty. She'd had news that would have changed everything, and instead, she'd heard his confession and made the choice to walk away rather than bind herself to a man who didn't deserve her trust. He found Amy in the hospital cafe during a rare moment when she was alone. No daughters in tow, no doctors demanding her attention, just a beautiful woman staring at cold coffee like it held answers to questions she was tired of asking. Ian approached slowly, giving her time to notice him, to object, to shut him down before he even started. She didn't look up. "We need to talk," Ian said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from her. "No, we don't." Amy still didn't meet his eyes. "You got your tour. You've seen the facility. Either you're interested in the partnership or you're not. Either way, there's nothing personal to discuss. You told the administrator you didn't remember me. I don't. We met briefly once. That hardly constitutes a memorable relationship. Amy, please, stop pretending. I know those are our daughters. I know you've been hiding from me for over a year. I know. You know nothing. Amy finally looked up, and the expression on her face made Ian's words die in his throat. Those girls are not your daughters, Ian. They're mine. Only mine. And if you're here because you've concocted some fantasy about being their father, let me save you the trouble. You're not. You never were. You never will be. The words hit like physical blows. What are you talking about? The timeline matches. You were 6 months pregnant when you left. The hospital bracelet email. The twins were born 3 months after I left you, which means I got pregnant about 2 months before we broke up. Amy spoke with the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow child. I was involved with someone else before you and I became serious. When I found out I was pregnant, I initially thought the babies were yours. But I did the genetic testing, Ian. The twins' father is a man I dated briefly before you and I started living together. Someone who has absolutely no interest in being a parent and signed away all rights before the girls were born. Ian felt the ground shifting beneath him, reality rearranging itself into configurations he couldn't process. You were going to tell me this the night I confessed about Singapore. Yes, I was going to explain the situation, apologize for the confusion, and suggest we figure out how to move forward as friends rather than partners expecting a child together. Amy picked up her coffee cup, set it back down without drinking. But then you told me you cheated, and I realized something important. I didn't owe you any explanations. I didn't owe you closure or clarity or anything at all. You'd already proven you weren't someone I wanted in my life or my daughter's lives, so why bother with the messy conversation? So you just disappeared. I exercised my right to leave a relationship that wasn't working. I used resources I'd kept private during our time together to start fresh somewhere new. I built a life for my daughters that didn't include a man who thinks fidelity is negotiable. Amy leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something cold and sharp. And before you ask, yes, I have money. Significant money. Money I inherited from my grandmother, but chose not to access while we were together, because I wanted to know if you loved me or the lifestyle I could provide. Turns out neither, so the question answered itself. Ian's mind raced through memories, recontextualizing everything he thought he knew. You were testing me. I was protecting myself. My grandmother spent her whole life building a pharmaceutical fortune, only to watch her daughter, my mother, marry a series of men who only wanted access to her money. She made me promise I'd never let wealth define my relationships, that I'd find someone who loved me for myself first and could handle the money second. Amy's laugh held no humor. You couldn't even handle the faithfulness part, so clearly I dodged a bullet by keeping my inheritance secret. Amy, I'm sorry. I know those words mean nothing after what I did, but I'm sorry. I've spent every day for the past year regretting. I don't care. The words were simple, final, delivered without heat or emotion. I don't care if you're sorry. I don't care if you regret it. I don't care if you've spent the past year in therapy or joined a monastery or whatever redemption arc you've been pursuing. You're irrelevant to my life and my daughter's lives, and the sooner you accept that, the better off we'll all be. Those little girls are none of your concern. Rory has a serious respiratory condition that requires specialist care, which is why we're in Seattle instead of somewhere else. Dylan is healthy and brilliant and protective of her sister in ways that break my heart every single day. They're loved. They're safe. They have everything they need. And what they don't need is you inserting yourself into their lives because you've decided to play the repentant ex-boyfriend. Ian felt something inside him cracking, splintering, transforming into something harder and more desperate. I spent a year looking for you. A year thinking I had a child out there somewhere who didn't know me. I've been grieving. Good. Amy stood, gathered her purse and phone with sharp, efficient movements. Grieve, feel bad, examine your choices, and decide to be better in your next relationship. But do it somewhere else, Ian. Do it in a city where I'm not trying to keep my daughter alive. Do it in a life that doesn't intersect with mine." She walked away before he could respond, heels clicking against linoleum with decisive finality. Ian sat alone in the cafe, surrounded by the smell of burned coffee and antiseptic, and tried to process what had just happened. The twins weren't his, had never been his. The entire year of grief and searching and obsessing had been based on a misunderstanding, on assumptions he'd made without ever confirming, on the arrogant belief that any child Amy carried had to be his. But knowing they weren't biologically his didn't make the longing go away. It didn't erase the image of little Rory with her tired eyes and stuffed elephant. It didn't stop him from wanting to know what Dylan looked like, what made her laugh, whether she had Amy's sharp wit or her own unique personality. Ian pulled out his phone, sent a message to his assistant cancelling everything for the next month, and made another decision that probably qualified as stalking, but felt like the only option available. He was staying in Seattle until he figured out if there was any version of reality where Amy Jones might give him a chance to prove he'd changed, even if the only thing that came from it was her acknowledgement that he was trying, even if she never forgave him, even if the twins never knew his name, even if he spent the rest of his life as a ghost, haunting the edges of their family, watching from a distance while they built something beautiful without him. He had to try, because the alternative was walking away from the only thing that had made him feel genuinely human in over a year. And Ian knew himself well enough by now to recognize that he'd never survive that loss a second time. Chapter 5. The Fortune Revealed. Discovering the truth about Amy's wealth required less detective work than Ian expected, mainly because once he started looking, the evidence was everywhere. A late-night internet search revealed that Amy Jones was the sole heir to the Morrison pharmaceutical empire, a company her grandmother had built from a single patent into a multinational corporation before selling it for an obscene amount of money and dying 5 years later. The fortune had been held in trust until Amy's 30th birthday, which had occurred approximately 2 weeks before she walked out of Ian's life. The timeline painted a picture that made Ian's chest ache. Amy had been weeks away from accessing billions when he confessed his infidelity. She'd been planning to share that news, along with the truth about the twins' paternity, probably testing to see how Ian would react to both revelations simultaneously. Instead, his betrayal had given her an easy out, a clean break from a relationship that she'd always known was temporary if he couldn't love her without the corrupting influence of her wealth. Ian sat in his hotel room at 3 in the morning, scrolling through articles about Amy's venture capital firm, her investments in healthcare startups, her quiet philanthropy that never sought publicity but transformed hospitals and research facilities wherever she directed her attention. This woman had been living in a modest apartment, wearing clothes from department stores, taking public transportation, all while sitting on a fortune that dwarfed everything Ian had worked his entire life to accumulate. She was slumming, Ian said aloud to the empty room, then immediately regretted the words because they sounded bitter and small. Amy hadn't been slumming. She'd been protecting herself from exactly the kind of man who would see her money before he saw her humanity, who would love her inheritance more than her actual self. Ian had failed that test before ever knowing he was taking it. The realization settled over him like a heavy coat, uncomfortable but inescapable. Even if he hadn't cheated, even if he'd been perfectly faithful and supportive, the moment Amy revealed her wealth, Ian would have changed. He knew himself well enough to admit it. He would have started seeing her differently, treating her with the kind of deference money commanded, making assumptions about their future that centered on her ability to fund whatever lifestyle he imagined. The infidelity had almost been a mercy in that context. It gave Amy a clear reason to leave before their relationship could be poisoned by the more insidious corruption of financial inequality. Over the following weeks, Ian transformed himself into a professional Amy watcher, learning her routines and habits without ever approaching her directly. She arrived at the hospital every morning at 8, left every night around 9 after Rory fell asleep. She worked from a laptop in the family lounge, taking calls that seemed to involve complicated medical terminology and investment strategies Ian could barely follow. She read to Rory for hours, her voice never tiring, her patience seemingly endless. Dylan appeared most afternoons after school, a whirlwind of energy and chatter who could make her sister laugh, even when Rory was clearly exhausted. The healthy twin bore an uncanny resemblance to Amy, but carried herself with a confidence that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the world. She drew pictures constantly, carried colored pencils everywhere, transformed hospital walls into impromptu art galleries with the staff's indulgent permission. Ian volunteered at the hospital, pulling strings and making donations until the administration couldn't refuse his offer to read to children in the pediatric ward. He was careful to treat Rory and Dylan exactly like every other child, never seeking special attention or trying to forge individual relationships that would raise Amy's suspicions. He read stories about dragons and princesses, about adventures and mysteries, about families that overcame obstacles through love and perseverance. Rory loved stories about brave girls who saved themselves. Dylan preferred tales about artists and dreamers who changed the world through creativity. Ian learned their preferences through careful observation, selected books that would resonate with their individual personalities, and felt something in his chest crack open every time one of them smiled at a particularly good plot twist. "You're the sad man," Dylan announced one afternoon, studying Ian with the kind of direct assessment children specialized in. "You always look sad when you read happy endings." Ian set down the book he'd been sharing with a group of kids, met Dylan's curious gaze. "Why do you think I look sad?" "Because happy endings make you think about someone you lost." Dylan spoke with the casual certainty of someone stating obvious facts. "My mama looks like that sometimes too. Not when she's with us, but sometimes when she thinks we're not watching, she gets this face that means she's remembering something that hurts." "Your mama is very strong," Ian said carefully. "She takes good care of you and your sister. I know. She's the best mama in the world." Dylan picked up a green crayon, started sketching on the paper placemat from her lunch tray. "But sometimes I think she's lonely, like she's missing a piece of herself that got lost somewhere." Ian's throat tightened. "What makes you think that?" "Because love is supposed to have two people," Dylan explained, her crayon moving across the paper with confident strokes. "And we love her so much, but we're her kids, not her person. Everyone needs their person, even if they lost them and can't find them again." She finished her drawing and held it up, a family portrait with Amy in the center, Rory and Dylan on either side, and in the background, sketched more faintly but still clearly present, a shadowy figure with sad eyes. "That's us," Dylan said. "And that's you. You're like part of our family but also not, and I haven't figured out why yet. But I think it's because you and Mama have the same lost look sometimes, like you're missing each other even though you're in the same building." Ian stared at the drawing, at this 4-year-old girl's casual insight that had just demolished every careful wall he'd built around his surveillance of Amy's life. "I don't know your mama very well." "You're lying," Dylan said without judgment. "Grown-ups lie a lot when the truth is too big to say. But lying doesn't make the truth go away. It just makes it hide better." Before Ian could respond, Amy appeared in the doorway of the family lounge, her expression carefully neutral as she took in the scene. Her daughter showing Ian a drawing that revealed far too much, Ian looking stricken and caught, the comfortable rapport between them suggesting this wasn't their first conversation. "Dylan, go check on your sister. I need to speak with Mr. Bell." Dylan gathered her crayons, shot Ian an apologetic look that seemed far too mature for her age, and disappeared into Rory's room. Amy closed the door behind her daughter, then turned to Ian with an expression that made him instinctively step backward. "I know what you've been doing," she said quietly. "I know you've been volunteering here specifically to spend time around my daughters. I know you've been watching us, learning our schedules, inserting yourself into our lives without permission. Amy, I just wanted... I don't care what you wanted. I told you to stay away from us, and you completely ignored that boundary." She crossed her arms, and Ian noticed for the first time how tired she looked beneath the perfect makeup and expensive clothes. "Here's what's going to happen now. You're going to stop volunteering here. You're going to leave Seattle. You're going to accept that whatever relationship we might have had ended the night you cheated, and you're going to move on with your life." "I can't." The words came out strangled, desperate. "I can't just walk away from them, from you. I know I don't have rights. I know they're not my children. I know I destroyed any chance we had together. But I can't just pretend I never saw them. Never watched Dylan draw, or heard Rory laugh, or witnessed you being the kind of mother who would burn the world down to save her kids. Then you're going to be disappointed and hurt, because that's not my problem to solve." Amy moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "You made choices, Ian. Choices that proved you weren't someone I could trust with my heart or my children's well-being. I'm not going to reward your stalker behavior by giving you access to our lives just because you've decided to feel bad about your mistakes. I don't want access. I just want nothing. You want nothing from us because you have no right to want anything. My daughters don't need a volunteer reader who's secretly obsessed with their mother. They need stability, health, and peace, none of which include you lurking around our lives like a ghost trying to haunt your way back into relevance." She left before Ian could respond, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. Ian stood alone in the family lounge, surrounded by children's drawings and scattered toys, and felt the full weight of his situation settle onto his shoulders. Amy knew, had probably always known, had watched him volunteer and observe and carefully maintain boundaries, waiting to see if he'd cross a line that would force her to shut everything down. Dylan's drawing remained on the table where she'd left it, the shadowy figure in the background, looking exactly as lost and desperate as Ian felt. He picked it up, studied the little girl's casual revelation that she understood far more than any 4-year-old should about loneliness and longing, and the ache of missing someone who's standing right in front of you. Then he folded the drawing carefully, placed it in his pocket, and walked out of the hospital, knowing he should get on a plane back to his empty life, but completely unable to make himself actually leave. Chapter 6. The Daughters. The hospital administration suggested Ian take a break from volunteering after Amy's formal complaint about his conduct, phrased professionally but understood clearly as a warning that his presence was causing more problems than his donations justified. Ian agreed to step back, promised to respect boundaries, then proceeded to completely ignore his own promises by continuing to show up at the hospital every single day, just no longer in an official capacity. He sat in the public waiting areas, pretended to read newspapers and respond to work emails, and watched the rhythms of Amy's family life unfold around him like a play he'd bought tickets to, but couldn't actually participate in. Rory's condition improved slowly, her breathing treatments becoming less frequent, her energy levels rising incrementally. Dylan continued her daily visits after school, bringing homework and artwork and an endless stream of stories about classmates and teachers who apparently lived in a world of chaos and drama. "There's a boy in my class who eats paste," Dylan informed her mother one afternoon, her voice carrying clearly to where Ian sat, pretending not to listen. "Mrs. Patterson says it's because he has sensory issues, but I think it's because he's testing whether adults are paying attention." Amy's laugh was genuine, warm, completely different from the cold professionalism she'd shown Ian in every interaction. "That's a very sophisticated theory for a second grader." "I'm very sophisticated for my age," Dylan agreed solemnly. "Rory says I'm precocious, which I think means I'm annoying, but in an impressive way." Precocious means advanced, baby. And you're not annoying. You're perfect. Nobody's perfect, Mama. That's what you always tell us when we mess up. Remember when I spilled paint all over your laptop and you said mistakes are how we learn? So technically I can't be perfect because perfect people don't make mistakes. Ian found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. Dylan was brilliant, funny, sharp as a knife, and twice as cutting when she wanted to be. She'd inherited Amy's intelligence, but filtered it through a personality that seemed to find joy in everything. Even hospital visits and paste-eating classmates. Rory, by contrast, was quieter, more observant, content to listen while her sister talked. But when she did speak, her words carried weight, careful and considered in ways that suggested she understood far more about her situation than anyone gave her credit for. "I think I'll be able to go home soon," Rory said one evening, her voice soft but certain. "My lungs feel different, stronger, like they're remembering how to work right." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Amy stroked her daughter's hair with infinite gentleness. "But even when you come home, we'll need to be careful. Keep up with your treatments. Watch for any signs you're struggling." "I know. I'm not trying to rush it. I just miss my own bed. Hospital beds are fine, but they smell like medicine even when they're clean." Dylan, sprawled across the foot of her sister's bed, with her homework spread around her like confetti, looked up from her math worksheet. "When you come home, can we have a party?" "Nothing big. Just us and maybe some cake." "We can absolutely have cake," Amy promised. "What kind do you want?" "Chocolate with vanilla frosting," both twins said simultaneously, then dissolved into giggles at their synchronized response. Ian watched this moment of normalcy, a mother and her daughters planning a small celebration, finding joy in the prospect of chocolate cake and going home, and felt something shift in his chest. These weren't abstract concepts anymore, weren't theoretical children he'd lost because of his own mistakes. They were real people with preferences and personalities, with inside jokes and shared laughter, with a family bond so strong it seemed to have its own gravity. He had no place in that constellation. Amy had made that abundantly clear. But he couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop wanting to be part of something that had never been his and never would be. Later that night, after Amy left and the hospital settled into its evening quiet, Ian found himself in Rory's room for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. He'd walked past a dozen times, told himself to leave, to respect boundaries, to stop being the creepy man who lurked around sick children. But something pulled him into that doorway, something that felt like destiny or stupidity or both. Rory was awake, reading by the dim light of her bedside lamp, and she looked up as Ian's shadow fell across her bed. "You're the sad story man," she said without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. "Dylan told me about your drawing. She says you know our mama from before." Ian froze, uncertain whether to lie or flee, or attempt some explanation that wouldn't sound insane, coming from a grown man to a 4-year-old girl. "I knew your mother a long time ago. We were friends." "Friends don't make people look sad," Rory observed, setting down her book with careful precision. "You make Mama look sad when she sees you, even though she pretends not to, and you always look sad when you look at us, so maybe you weren't really friends. Maybe you were something else that went wrong." "You're very smart," Ian said, meaning it completely. "I have to be smart. I'm sick, so I can't be normal, which means I have to be something else worth keeping around." Rory spoke without self-pity, just stating facts about her world. "Dylan says I'm being dramatic, but I notice things when everyone thinks I'm sleeping. I notice how Mama cries sometimes in the bathroom when she thinks we can't hear. I notice how she looks at her phone like she's hoping someone will call even though she never lets anyone's calls through." "Your mother loves you very much," Ian said, feeling inadequate and lost. "Both of you, everything she does is for you." "I know. But loving us isn't the same as being happy. Mama's a good actress. but I see through it sometimes. Rory adjusted her breathing tube, a gesture so practiced it was clearly automatic. You hurt her, didn't you? That's why she looks sad when she sees you, because you remind her of something that went wrong. Ian couldn't lie to this child who saw through everything with those sharp, tired eyes. Yes, I hurt her very badly. And I'm sorry, even though sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry is a start, Rory said. But starts don't mean anything unless you finish what you started. Are you going to finish? Or are you just going to keep being sad and making Mama sad until someone makes you leave? I don't know how to finish. Your mother doesn't want me around. She's made that very clear. Maybe you're asking the wrong question. Rory picked up her book again, signaling the conversation was ending on her terms. Maybe instead of asking how to make Mama forgive you, you should ask how to become someone worth forgiving. Those are different things, you know. She returned to her reading, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he'd never been there. Ian stood in the doorway, feeling like he'd just been schooled by someone a quarter his age, then quietly left before anyone could catch him having inappropriate conversations with hospitalized children. But Rory's words echoed in his head all night. Become someone worth forgiving, not someone begging for forgiveness, not someone performing redemption for an audience, someone actually fundamentally worth the effort of forgiveness, whether or not that forgiveness ever came. It was the first time in over a year that Ian had considered the possibility that his redemption might not have anything to do with Amy accepting him back into her life, might not be about winning or earning or achieving anything external at all, but about becoming a better human simply because that was the right thing to do, regardless of whether anyone noticed or cared. The thought terrified him, because it suggested a path forward that didn't include Amy or the twins, that didn't end with some triumphant reconciliation where everyone cried and hugged and agreed to start over. It suggested that maybe the price of his betrayal was a lifetime of being better without ever receiving recognition for that improvement, of doing the right thing purely because it was right, not because it might eventually get him what he wanted. Ian walked back to his hotel through rain that soaked him to the skin, tilted his face up to the sky, and let the cold water wash over him like a baptism he hadn't earned but desperately needed anyway. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. Amy's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay. All clean lines and expensive furniture, and the kind of view that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. Ian had pulled every string he had to arrange this meeting, framing it as a business discussion about potential partnerships, banking on Amy's professionalism, preventing her from refusing outright. She'd agreed to 30 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, and Ian used every second of the elevator ride up to prepare himself for whatever was about to happen. The receptionist directed him to a conference room, where Amy already waited, seated at the head of a table designed for corporate warfare, with documents spread before her and an expression that could have frozen nitrogen. She wore navy blue, today, severe and expensive, with her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized her bone structure and the absolute lack of welcome in her eyes. "You have 28 minutes remaining," Amy said without preamble. "I suggest you use them wisely." Ian sat across from her, feeling like he was facing a firing squad. "I'm not here about business." "Then you wasted both our time, because I have nothing personal to discuss with you." Amy glanced at her watch, a gesture clearly designed to emphasize his dwindling opportunity. 27 minutes. "I need you to understand." "You need me to understand nothing. I need you to understand that I'm giving you this meeting as a professional courtesy because your company has resources that might benefit my portfolio companies, not because I have any interest in revisiting our past relationship or entertaining your apologies." She tapped the documents in front of her. "I've reviewed your company's technological capabilities. They're impressive. If you want to discuss potential partnerships, we can do that. If you want to continue stalking my family, this meeting is over." "I'm not stalking your family. I'm trying to—" "What? Make amends? Prove you've changed? Convince me that your betrayal was just a momentary lapse in judgment rather than a revelation of your character?" Amy leaned back in her chair, her posture perfect, her control absolute. "I don't care, Ian. I genuinely, completely do not care about your redemption arc or your emotional journey or whatever therapy-speak terminology you've learned to describe your guilt." "Then why are you so angry? If you don't care, why does my presence upset you?" "Because you're teaching my daughters that boundaries are optional. Because you're inserting yourself into our lives despite explicit instructions to stay away. Because every time I turn around in that hospital, you're there, lurking and watching and making everything about you and your feelings when this situation has nothing to do with you." Amy's voice remained level, professional, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "You think you're being romantic or persistent or whatever narrative you've constructed, but what you're actually being is entitled. You're acting like you have rights to my attention, my forgiveness, my time, when you surrendered all of those rights the moment you decided fidelity was too hard. I made a mistake." "No, you made a choice." Amy stood, moved to the windows overlooking the water, speaking with her back to him like he'd spoken to her on the night everything ended. "You were in Singapore for work. You had drinks with colleagues. A woman expressed interest, and you chose, actively, deliberately chose, to go back to her hotel room instead of calling me, instead of going to your own room, instead of doing literally anything else that wouldn't have destroyed our relationship. That's not a mistake. That's a decision." Ian felt anger rising in his throat, defensive and ugly. People make bad decisions. People get drunk and do things they regret. That doesn't define... It absolutely defines you. Your choices define you. That's what defines all of us. Amy turned back to face him, and the expression on her face made Ian's anger evaporate instantly. "You want to know what happened after I left your office that night? You want to understand why I disappeared so completely?" "Yes. I drove home and sat in the dark for 6 hours trying to understand what I'd done wrong, what I'd failed to provide, what inadequacy in me had driven you to sleep with someone else." Amy's voice remained steady, but Ian could hear the pain beneath it now, carefully controlled but still present. "I ran through every conversation we'd had in the weeks before Singapore, looking for signs I'd missed, warnings I'd ignored, evidence that I should have seen this coming. I blamed myself completely, Ian. I decided I'd been too busy with work, too tired from the pregnancy, too focused on preparing for motherhood to give you enough attention." "Amy, no, it wasn't you. It was never... I know that now. But that night I convinced myself I'd failed you somehow, that I'd driven you to infidelity through my own inadequacies. And then I got angry, furious, not at you, but at myself for taking that blame, for making your betrayal about my failures when it was actually just about your weakness." Amy returned to her seat, met his eyes with unflinching directness. "So I left. I claimed my inheritance, which I'd been planning to tell you about that same night. I used that money to disappear, to build a new life, to create a future for my daughters, that didn't include a man who thought so little of me that he couldn't keep his pants zipped during a business trip. The twins. You said they're not mine. They're not, but you didn't know that when you cheated. You thought you were betraying your pregnant girlfriend. You thought you were risking your child's family stability for one drunken night with a stranger. That's who you are, Ian. That's the man you revealed yourself to be. And whether or not those children share your DNA is completely irrelevant to that fundamental truth about your character." The words hit like bullets, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Ian tried to formulate a defense, some explanation that would make her understand, but every argument died before reaching his lips because Amy was right. He'd thought she was pregnant with his child. He'd betrayed her anyway. The twins' actual paternity was irrelevant to the enormity of what he'd done. "I'm sorry," Ian said, the words feeling hollow and insufficient. "I know that means nothing to you, but I'm sorry. I've spent every day for over a year being sorry." "Good, be sorry. Carry that guilt. Let it shape how you treat people in the future. But don't expect me to absolve you just because you feel bad." Amy gathered her documents with sharp, efficient movements. "Here's what's going to happen now. You're going to stop volunteering at the hospital. You're going to stop showing up in waiting areas, pretending to read newspapers. You're going to stop having inappropriate conversations with my 4-year-old daughters about our past relationship. You're going to leave Seattle, return to your life, and accept that some things stay broken. What if I can't do that? What if I can't just walk away? Then you'll be disappointed, uncomfortable, and increasingly unwelcome in spaces I control, which in this city is quite a lot of spaces." Amy stood, moved toward the door. "I'm not trying to punish you, Ian. I'm trying to protect my children from a man who's demonstrated he can't be trusted. If you genuinely care about their well-being, you'll respect that boundary, instead of treating it as an obstacle to overcome." "They're good kids," Ian said quietly. "Rory's brilliant. Dylan's funny. They're lucky to have you as their mother." "I know. And they'll continue having me as their mother, providing stability and love and everything they need, long after you've moved on to whatever's next in your life." Amy opened the conference room door, held it with pointed expectation. "Your 28 minutes are up, Mr. Bell. Thank you for your interest in partnership opportunities, but I don't think our companies are a good fit." Ian stood, walked toward the exit, then paused at the threshold. "For what it's worth, I think you're wrong about me. Not about what I did, that was indefensible, but about who I am now, who I'm trying to become. You don't have to care about that. You don't have to forgive me or give me chances I haven't earned. But you're wrong if you think I'm the same person who hurt you, because that person couldn't have survived what losing you has taught me." "Pretty words," Amy said. "But I've heard pretty words from you before, and they didn't stop you from betraying me. So forgive me if I don't put much stock in what you say versus what you do." She closed the door in his face, literally and metaphorically, and Ian stood in the hallway of her building, surrounded by her success and her power and her absolute refusal to give him anything resembling hope. And he finally understood what Rory had been trying to tell him. Becoming someone worth forgiving and actually receiving forgiveness were completely different things, and he might achieve the first without ever experiencing the second. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Ian emerged onto the street into typical Seattle rain, pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, and started walking with no destination in mind. His phone buzzed with messages from work, from his mother asking when he'd be back, from friends wondering if he'd disappeared off the face of the earth. He ignored all of them and just walked, processing everything Amy had said, accepting the brutal honesty of her assessment, recognizing that maybe the kindest thing he could do was exactly what she'd asked: disappear from her life completely and let her raise her daughters in peace. But even as he thought it, Ian knew he wouldn't do it, couldn't do it. Something in him had broken the night Amy left, and the only thing that made him feel remotely whole was knowing she and the twins existed somewhere in the world, even if he couldn't be part of their lives. Watching from a distance was pathetic and sad, and probably qualified as unhealthy obsession, but it was all he had, and giving it up felt like dying. So he'd stay in Seattle a little longer. He'd stay away from the hospital like Amy demanded. He'd respect her boundaries and stop having conversations with her daughters. But he wouldn't leave entirely, wouldn't return to his empty life, pretending he'd never seen what a real family looked like. Wouldn't erase this city from his geography just because his presence here made Amy uncomfortable. It was selfish. It was probably wrong, But Ian had already proven himself capable of spectacular selfishness and wrongness. So adding this to the list barely registered against the magnitude of his original sin. He walked until his feet hurt, until the rain soaked through his jacket and his teeth chattered from cold, until the physical discomfort almost matched the emotional pain-carving holes in his chest. Then he found a bar, ordered whiskey he didn't want, and sat alone trying to figure out how to become someone worth forgiving when the person who needed to forgive him had made it abundantly clear she never would. Chapter 8. The Transformation. The man who returned from Seattle was not the same man who'd left, though the changes were subtle enough that most people didn't notice. Ian stopped attending galas and charity events where his presence was expected, started eating lunch at his desk, or not at all, began reviewing every company policy through the lens of whether it prioritized profits over people. His board thought he was having a breakdown. His mother thought he'd joined a cult. His friends stopped calling because conversations with him had become exhausting exercises in watching someone slowly dismantle the life they'd spent years building. Ian sold the penthouse first, the ostentatious display of wealth that had never felt like home anyway. He moved into a modest apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew his name, furnished it with second-hand items that served their purpose without making statements about his taste or status. The money from the sale went to various charities Amy supported, donated anonymously because he was learning slowly, painfully, that doing good things meant nothing if he did them to be noticed. Work became something different, something approaching meaningful. Ian restructured his company to prioritize employee well-being over quarterly earnings, implemented policies his board hated but couldn't quite argue against, created programs that reduced profits slightly while dramatically improving morale and retention. People thought he'd lost his edge, that the drive that made him successful had somehow burnt out, but Ian didn't care. He was tired of building empires on the backs of people he'd never meet. Tired of measuring success by numbers that grew larger while his actual life grew smaller. His mother demanded answers over increasingly hostile phone calls about why he was sabotaging everything he'd worked for. Ian tried to explain about becoming someone worth more than his net worth, about learning to measure value in human terms rather than financial ones, about recognizing that all his success meant nothing if he was fundamentally empty at his core. She heard exactly none of it, eventually stopped calling, which Ian interpreted as the final severing of relationships built on mutual incomprehension rather than actual love. Loneliness carved itself into Ian's daily existence like water wearing a waystone. He'd always been surrounded by people without ever feeling truly connected to any of them. But now, the superficiality of those relationships became impossible to ignore. Friends who only called when they needed favors. Colleagues who valued his wallet over his opinions. Women who dated the idea of him without ever bothering to learn the reality. All of it felt hollow and pointless, so Ian stopped participating in the charade entirely and sat alone in his small apartment, eating takeout, and wondering if this was what Amy had felt like during their relationship. Looking at him and seeing someone who looked right but felt wrong. He thought about her constantly, about her and the twins, about the life they were living in Seattle without him. No more private investigators, no more surveillance or boundary violations. But the thoughts remained insistent and painful, reminding him daily that somewhere out there existed a woman he'd loved and lost, and a pair of girls he'd never have the right to know. Fall turned to winter, turned to spring. Ian celebrated his birthday alone, marked the anniversary of Amy's departure alone, watched another year slip past, while he performed this slow transformation of self that felt necessary but brought no particular joy or satisfaction. People kept asking if he was okay, and Ian kept saying yes, because how do you explain that you're fine but also fundamentally changed? That you've looked at yourself clearly and found so many things wrong that fixing them requires taking apart everything you thought you were and starting over from scratch. Then Rory got sick again. The news reached Ian through channels he'd maintained, despite promising to leave Amy alone, a hospital contact he'd cultivated, a nurse who'd befriended him during his volunteer days, someone who understood that his interest in the Jones family wasn't malicious, even if it was inappropriate. Rory's respiratory condition, which had been improving steadily, suddenly deteriorated. Experimental treatment was needed, the kind that required special approvals and research access and connections in pharmaceutical circles that Amy had but couldn't leverage fast enough. Ian sat with this information for 3 days, arguing with himself about whether intervening constituted the kind of boundary violation Amy had explicitly forbidden. Rory wasn't his daughter. Her health wasn't his concern. Amy had made it abundantly clear she wanted nothing from him, which presumably included help during medical emergencies. But every time Ian tried to convince himself to stay out of it, he imagined that little girl in her hospital bed telling him that starts didn't mean anything unless you finished them, and he knew with absolute certainty that walking away now would prove he'd learned nothing from his year of attempted transformation. He made phone calls, pulled strings, called in favors from pharmaceutical researchers he'd met during his previous attempts to change his company culture, navigated a labyrinth of regulatory approvals and research protocols that would have taken months through normal channels but could be expedited with the right pressure in the right places. He worked around the clock for 2 weeks, coordinating with Amy's team without actually speaking to her, positioning himself as a resource rather than a savior. The treatment became available 3 months ahead of schedule. Ian had the approval. Documents couriered to Amy's office with no return address, no note explaining his involvement, no attempt to take credit or leverage this into renewed contact. He simply made it possible and then stepped back, respecting boundaries while still doing what needed to be done. But Amy found out anyway because of course she did. A hospital administrator let something slip, or a pharmaceutical researcher mentioned his name, or Amy simply did the math and realized that nobody else had both motive and means to push through approvals that quickly. She called him for the first time in over a year, her voice tight and angry, and somehow relieved all at once. "What did you do?" Ian closed his eyes, leaned against his apartment window, overlooking a view that cost almost nothing but somehow it felt more valuable than anything in his previous penthouse. "What needed to be done?" "I told you to stay away from my family." "I know, but Rory needed that treatment, and I could help get it faster, so I did. No strings attached, no expectations, just helping because I could." Silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Amy spoke again, her voice softer but still careful. "Thank you. I'm angry you overstepped, but I'm grateful you did. Rory has a chance now, and that matters more than my pride." "How is she?" "Scared, brave, more resilient than any 4-year-old should have to be." Amy exhaled shakily. "The treatment is grueling, Ian. She's going to be in intensive care for weeks, maybe months, and I don't know if I can watch her go through this. Don't know if I'm strong enough to sit by her bed and watch her suffer, even if it's helping." "You're the strongest person I've ever met," Ian said quietly. "You'll get through this because she needs you to, and you've never let your daughters down." "I'm not strong. I'm terrified every single day. I just hide it better than most people." "No, that's what strength is, being terrified and showing up anyway." Another silence, this one less hostile and more exhausted. "I should go. Rory's procedure is in an hour, and I need to be there when she wakes up." "Amy, wait. Is there anything else I can do? Anything at all? You've done enough. More than enough. Please just let me handle the rest." She hung up before Ian could respond, and he stood alone in his apartment holding a phone that felt heavier than it should, wondering if he'd just made things better or worse, if helping had been the right choice. or just another violation disguised as care. But Rory needed that treatment, and Ian had been able to provide it, and maybe that was enough. Maybe becoming someone worth forgiving meant doing the right thing even when it violated boundaries, even when it brought no recognition or gratitude, even when the person you hurt told you to stay away. But you helped them anyway because some things mattered more than respecting wishes. Or maybe he was just justifying another boundary violation, making himself feel noble about something that was really just more proof he couldn't respect Amy's clearly stated needs. Ian didn't know, couldn't tell anymore where the line was between helping and interfering, between caring from a distance and stalking, between becoming better and just becoming better at disguising the same selfishness. So he did the only thing he could. He went back to his small life, his restructured company, his solitary existence, and tried to trust that if helping Rory was wrong, Amy would tell him so clearly enough that even he couldn't misunderstand. Chapter 9. The Crisis. The call came at 3 in the morning, and Ian answered on the first ring because he'd been awake anyway, staring at his ceiling and thinking about all the ways a person could fail at redemption. Amy's voice sounded hollow, drained of everything except exhaustion. Rory crashed during a routine procedure. They're working on her now. Dylan's having nightmares. I can't do this alone anymore. Ian was dressed and in his car before his brain fully processed what she'd said. The drive to Seattle took hours, traffic and weather conspiring against him, and he used every minute to prepare himself for whatever awaited at the hospital. Amy had called him, after explicitly demanding he stay away. After months of silence, she'd called him. That meant something terrible had happened, or something in her had broken, or both. He found Amy in a small chapel off the main hospital corridor, sitting alone in a pew, with her head bowed and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She looked diminished somehow, all her power and polish stripped away by fear, until she was just a terrified mother praying for her daughter's life. Ian slid into the pew beside her, didn't speak, just sat close enough that she'd know she wasn't alone, but far enough that he wasn't presuming anything. They said the procedure was routine, Amy spoke without lifting her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Just checking the placement of her treatment line, making sure everything was working correctly. But something went wrong. Her oxygen levels dropped. Her heart stopped. They're trying to stabilize her now, but nobody can tell me if she's going to make it. Ian wanted to offer comfort, to promise everything would be okay, to say all the meaningless things people say during crises. But he'd learned enough over the past year to know that platitudes were worse than silence, so he just sat there and let Amy talk if she needed to, or pray if she preferred, offering presents without expecting anything in return. Dylan asked me last week if Rory was going to die, Amy continued, tears finally starting to track down her face, though her voice remained steady. I told her no, that we were doing everything possible to make sure Rory got better. I promised her they'd grow up together, go to college together, be bridesmaids at each other's weddings. I promised things I have no power to guarantee, because what else do you tell a 4-year-old who's terrified of losing her sister? You tell her the truth as kindly as possible. You tell her that you're doing everything you can. You tell her she's loved and safe, even if her sister isn't. Ian kept his voice low, soothing. And then you hope like hell it's enough. It's not enough. Nothing I do is enough. I have all this money, all these resources, all this supposed power, and I can't save my daughter. I can't make her lungs work right. I can't protect her from the reality that her body is broken in ways I can't fix. Amy turned to look at Ian for the first time, her face streaked with tears and mascara, all pretense of control completely abandoned. I've been so angry at you, so determined to keep you out of our lives because you proved you couldn't be trusted. But right now, I don't care about trust or boundaries or any of it. I just need someone to sit with me while I wait to find out if my daughter is going to live or die, and you're the only person I could think to call." "I'm here," Ian said simply, "for as long as you need me." They sat together in that chapel for hours, while doctors worked on Rory, while Dylan slept fitfully in a family lounge under the care of a hospital social worker, while the world continued, spinning despite everything feeling suspended and terrible. Amy cried quietly, occasionally gripping Ian's hand with desperate strength, and Ian let her, offering solid presence in a situation where nothing else he could provide would make any difference. The doctor finally came with news just after dawn. Rory was stable. The crisis had passed. She'd need more time to recover, but she was going to make it. Amy collapsed against Ian in pure relief, and for those few moments all the walls between them dissolved completely. He held her while she sobbed, stroked. Her hair murmured meaningless comfort, and felt something in his chest crack open that he'd kept carefully locked away since the night she left. But then Amy pulled herself together, straightened up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and the walls started rebuilding themselves brick by brick. "Thank you for coming. I shouldn't have called you, but I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad you called. I'm glad I could be here. This doesn't change anything between us," Amy said, needing to establish boundaries even in the aftermath of crisis. "I'm grateful for your help with the treatment access. I'm grateful you came when I called tonight. But gratitude isn't forgiveness, and this doesn't mean—" "I know," Ian interrupted gently. "You don't have to explain. I understand." "Do you?" "Because I can see it in your eyes, Ian. You're hoping this is some kind of turning point, some moment where everything changes and we find our way back to each other. But that's not what this is. This is me being human and scared and needing someone familiar, not me deciding to give us another chance." "I understand," Ian repeated, and this time he meant it completely. This wasn't a reconciliation. This was just one terrified person reaching out to another person who'd once mattered, using old connections in a moment of desperation. "Can I see her? Rory? Just for a minute?" Amy hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. She might not wake up, but you can sit with her." Rory's room looked like every intensive care unit. Too many machines, too many monitors, too many tubes connecting. Her small body to equipment designed to keep her alive. She looked tiny and fragile against the hospital bed, her breathing assisted by ventilator, her eyes closed, her usual spark completely submerged beneath medical necessity. Ian stood at the foot of the bed, unable to move closer, struck by how breakable she looked. "She asked about you last week," Amy said from the doorway. "Asked if the sad story man was ever coming back to read to them. I told her you'd moved away, that you had other responsibilities. She told me I was lying, that grown-ups always lie when they don't want to explain the truth. She's too smart for her own good. She's exactly as smart as she needs to be to survive in a world that keeps trying to break her." Amy moved to Rory's bedside, adjusted a blanket with infinite gentleness. "When she wakes up, when she's stronger, maybe you could visit properly. Maybe we could try supervised contact, where the twins know you're someone from my past who wants to be in their lives, and we see how it goes." Ian's heart seized with hope he knew was dangerous. "Are you serious?" "I don't know. Maybe. Ask me. Again, when Rory's out of intensive care, when Dylan stops having nightmares, when I'm not making decisions based on crisis and fear." Amy met his eyes with a warning look. "And don't mistake this for anything more than what it is. Me acknowledging that you helped when we needed it, that you've respected boundaries even when it cost you, that maybe there's room for something different than the absolute no contact I've been insisting on." Whatever you're comfortable with," Ian said quickly, afraid she'd change her mind if he showed too much eagerness. "On your terms, in your time, with whatever restrictions you need to feel safe. My daughter's safety and well-being come first. Always. If you do anything to hurt them or confuse them or make them think you're something you're not. I won't. I promise. Amy, I won't. She studied him for a long moment, looking for lies or hidden agendas, then apparently deciding to take a leap of faith she clearly didn't feel ready for. Okay, we'll try. Slowly, carefully, with the understanding that I can shut this down completely at any moment if it's not working. Thank you. Thank you. I won't. Don't make promises yet. Just be the person you're claiming to have become, and we'll see if that's someone who deserves a place in our lives. Dylan appeared in the doorway then, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and froze when she saw Ian. The sad man is back. His name is Ian, Amy said gently. And yes, he's here. He's going to be around sometimes if that's okay with you and Rory. But is he your person? Is he the piece you've been missing? I don't know yet, baby. Maybe. Or maybe he's just a friend who wants to help. We're going to figure it out together. Dylan studied Ian with her usual direct assessment, then apparently decided he passed whatever test she'd been conducting. Okay, but if you make Mama sad again, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I'll do my best not to disappoint you, Ian said, meaning it more than he'd meant almost anything in his life. The little girl nodded once, satisfied, then climbed onto her mother's lap and buried her face in Amy's shoulder. Ian watched them, this mother and daughter who'd survived so much, this family he had no real claim to, but desperately wanted to be part of anyway, and felt something settle in his chest that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of understanding what he'd been searching for all along. Not absolution, not forgiveness, just the chance to show up consistently, to prove through action rather than words that he'd changed, and to accept whatever role Amy decided he could have in their lives without demanding more than she was willing to give. Chapter 10. The Price and the Prize. Spring in Seattle brought cherry blossoms and possibility, the kind of weather that made people believe in new beginnings even when they knew better. Rory came home from the hospital on a Tuesday, her treatments reduced to manageable maintenance, her energy returning in incremental victories. Dylan made welcome home signs that covered every surface of their house, insisted on baking a cake that emerged lopsided but edible, treated her sister's return like the second coming. Ian was not present for the homecoming because boundaries still mattered, because Amy had made it clear that his role in their lives would be carefully controlled and deliberately limited, because earning trust took time and patience he was still learning to practice. But he sent flowers, not ostentatious arrangements that screamed, "Look at my wealth," just simple daisies because Dylan had mentioned once that they were Rory's favorites, and a card that said nothing except, "Glad you're home." 2 days later, Amy called and suggested coffee. They met at a place near the hospital, neutral territory where neither of them had history, and sat across from each other with beverages neither particularly wanted. Amy looked tired, but less haunted than she had during Rory's crisis, and Ian tried not to read too much into the fact that she'd agreed to meet at all. The flowers were nice, Amy said, stirring sugar into coffee she usually drank black. Rory loved them, asked who they were from, and I told her they were from a friend who was happy she was better. Is that what I am? A friend? I don't know what you are yet. Someone from my past who hurt me badly, but showed up when it mattered. Someone I don't trust, but can't quite dismiss. Someone I'm trying to figure out if I want around my daughters' lives. Amy set down her spoon with deliberate care. You've changed. I can see that. The way you dress, the way you carry yourself, the way you didn't push when I set boundaries during Rory's hospitalization. You're not the same man who cheated on me. I'm trying not to be. Trying is a start, but the girls need more than trying. They need consistency, reliability, someone who shows up not because it serves his own need for redemption, but because showing up is what you do for people you care about. I care about them, Ian said quietly. About all three of you. Not because I think it'll get me something, but because caring about you is the only thing that's made me feel human in over a year. That's not enough. Caring isn't enough if you can't follow through, if you disappear when things get difficult, if you hurt them the way you hurt me. Amy met his eyes with clear directness. I'm willing to give you supervised access. You can spend time with the twins in controlled settings where I'm present. You can read to them, play games with them, be part of their lives in limited ways, but you need to understand that this is conditional. One mistake, one boundary violation, one moment where I feel like you're prioritizing your feelings over their well-being, and it's over completely. I understand, and I'll respect whatever limits you set. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because Dylan keeps asking about the sad man, and Rory told me she thinks you're lonely and that lonely people deserve friends even if they made mistakes. Amy's expression softened slightly. My daughters see something in you I'm not sure I can see yet, something worth knowing, and I trust their judgment even when I don't trust mine. They sat in silence for a moment, coffee cooling between them, the weight of their history pressing down like atmospheric pressure. Finally, Ian spoke the question that had been burning in his chest since Amy first called about Rory's crisis. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? Not now, maybe not for years, but eventually? Amy considered the question with the same careful thought she brought to every important decision. I don't know. Forgiveness isn't something I can manufacture just because you've changed or because you helped during an emergency. It's something that happens organically when the pain of holding on to anger becomes greater than the pain of letting it go. I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever be there. That's fair. What I can tell you is that I'm not actively angry anymore. I'm not carrying around rage or fantasies of revenge or spending energy hating you. You're just someone who hurt me badly, who's apparently trying to be better, and who my daughters have decided deserves a chance. Amy finished her coffee, grimaced at its bitterness. So we'll try this carefully, with the understanding that we're not building towards some romantic reconciliation, that this is about the twins having another stable adult in their lives, not about us repairing our relationship. I can live with that. Can you really? Because I see how you look at me, Ian. I see the hope in your eyes, the way you're holding on to the possibility that this could become something more. And I need you to understand that it probably won't. I need you to be okay with being a friend to my daughters without expecting it to lead anywhere else. Ian took a breath, forced himself to be honest even though the truth tasted bitter. I'll always love you. I'll probably always hope for something more. But I can keep those feelings to myself and focus on what's actually possible instead of what I want. If all I ever get is supervised visits with your daughters and cordial conversations over coffee, that's infinitely more than I deserve. Good, because that might be all there ever is, and you need to make peace with that before we go any further. They left the coffee shop together, walked to their separate cars, and Ian felt something shift in his chest that might have been acceptance or might have been the beginning of understanding that love sometimes meant wanting good things for people even when those good things didn't include you. Amy was giving him a chance, carefully controlled and heavily restricted, and that was more than he'd dared hope for during the long months of transformation and self-examination. The first supervised visit happened on Saturday at a public park, where the twins could run and play, while Amy watched from a bench close enough to intervene if necessary. Rory looked healthier than Ian had ever seen her, color in her cheeks and energy in her movements, while Dylan provided running commentary on everything from cloud shapes to the injustice of school cafeteria food. Do you have kids of your own? Rory asked while they sat on swings, pumping their legs in competing rhythms. No, Ian said honestly. No kids, no family except my mother, who I don't see very often. That sounds lonely. It is sometimes. But then I get to spend time with interesting people like you and your sister, and that makes it less lonely. Dylan says you're in love with our mama, Rory stated, with the casual cruelty of someone too young to understand subtlety. She says you look at mama the way princes look at princesses in stories. Your sister is very observant. Is it true? Are you in love with her? Ian glanced toward Amy, who was pretending not to eavesdrop while clearly hanging on every word. I care about your mama very much, but whether that's love or something else, I don't know. What I do know is that she's an amazing person who deserves the best, and I'm trying to figure out if I can be part of that, or if I should just be grateful she's letting me know you and Dylan. That's a confusing answer, Rory said. Grown-ups use a lot of words when simple ones would work better. You're absolutely right. Simple version, yes, I love your mama. But that doesn't mean anything will happen because love isn't enough on its own. You need trust and respect and time, and those things take work. Oh, that makes sense. Rory jumped off her swing at the peak of its arc, landed in a crouch that would have terrified Amy if she'd seen it. I think you should keep trying. Mama's been alone since forever, and Dylan and I aren't enough to make her happy, even though we're pretty great. You're extremely great, Ian agreed. But you're right that everyone needs their own person, not just their kids. So you'll keep trying, keep showing up and being nice until she decides to trust you again? As long as your mama lets me, yes. I'll keep trying. Rory nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran off to join Dylan on the climbing structure. Ian returned to the bench, where Amy sat watching her daughters with the fierce attention of someone who'd almost lost one, and wouldn't survive losing either. Rory thinks I should keep trying, Ian said, sitting carefully at the opposite end of the bench. She's concerned you're lonely. She worries too much. As since she was old enough to understand her condition makes her different. Amy kept her eyes on the twins. But she's not wrong. I'm lonely. Not for a relationship necessarily, but for adult companionship that doesn't revolve around medical appointments and business deals. Would you ever consider... Don't. Amy cut him off before he could finish. Don't ask if there's a future for us romantically, because I don't know, and I can't know until you've proven yourself over time. What I can tell you is that I don't hate you anymore. I don't even actively dislike you. You're just someone I'm cautiously allowing back into my orbit. Because my daughter's like you, and because you've done enough right lately that it seems worth exploring. Fair enough. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Rory and Dylan play, and Ian felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year, contentment. Not happiness exactly. Not the soaring joy of getting everything he wanted. Just quiet satisfaction at being allowed this much. At sitting on a park bench with the woman he loved while her daughters played, at being part of their day, even in this limited capacity. They asked if you could come to Rory's birthday party next month, Amy said eventually. Nothing big, just us and cake. Dylan specified chocolate with vanilla frosting. I'd be honored. Don't bring expensive gifts. Books are good. Experiences are better. Nothing that suggests you're trying to buy their affection. Understood. And Ian, Amy finally turned to look at him fully. Thank you. For staying away when I asked. For helping when Rory needed it. For being patient with the process that probably feels impossibly slow. You didn't have to do any of that, and it matters that you did. I'd do anything for you. For them. For this chance you're giving me, even though I don't deserve it. You're right. You don't deserve it. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is becoming someone who could deserve it eventually, and we're figuring out together whether that's possible. Dylan called for her mother's attention, showing off a successful climb to the top of the structure. Amy waved, smiled, radiating pride in her daughter's accomplishment. Rory joined her sister at the summit, and the two of them sat side by side against the sky, and Ian took a mental photograph of this moment. These two extraordinary little girls who'd brought him back to something approaching humanity, and the woman who'd given him a chance he hadn't earned, but would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. The story didn't end with declarations or promises or anything resembling certainty. It ended with four people in a park on a Saturday afternoon, learning to exist in the same space without old wounds destroying everything, building something fragile and uncertain that might, with tremendous care and patience, eventually become something like family, or it might not. It might collapse under the weight of history and hurt, and Ian's fundamental inability to be the person Amy needed. But for now, for today, it was enough to sit on this bench and watch her daughters play, and know that he'd been given a second chance at being present, even if presence was all he ever got. Dylan came running over, grabbed Ian's hand with sticky fingers and Amy's hand with her other, creating a chain that included Rory when she arrived seconds later. They stood connected like that, the four of them, while the twins chatted about cake and parties and whether chocolate or vanilla frosting was objectively superior. Amy didn't pull away. She met Ian's eyes over the girls' heads with an expression that clearly communicated, "This isn't forgiveness, and don't mistake this for more than it is, and you still have so much to prove." Ian nodded his understanding, accepting those terms completely, because getting to hold Dylan's sticky hand while standing in a chain that included Amy and Rory felt like winning the lottery after spending a year certain he'd never win anything. Again, the price of his betrayal had been everything. But the prize, this careful, tentative, heavily conditional possibility of being part of their lives, might just be worth every painful lesson he'd had to learn along the way.